Thank you so much for being with us today.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us as we explore the history of women's rights in Los Angeles. I'm Gennie Truelock. I'm the programs manager at the Homestead Museum, and I'm also going to be your moderator for this afternoon. Since this year marks the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment, which actually just happened about 5 days ago, giving women across the United States the right to vote, we're particularly eager to have our guests join us today, since they worked on a technical survey of locations associated with various women's rights issues in the city of Los Angeles from 1850 through about the 1980s. Today, we are joined by Sara Delgadillo Cruz, pardon me, preservation planner with Los Angeles City Planning, Office of Historic Resources, Christine Lazzaretto, managing principal of Historic Resources Group, and Sian Winship, the president of the, sorry, lost my place there. I'm going to make sure I get this title right. President of the Society of Architectural Historians, Southern California chapter, and she's also an independent consultant. Sara, Christine, and Sian are going to share with us how this project came to be, their research, and also highlight some of the findings of the document that was created for the city of Los Angeles. After which, we will then open it up for a Q&A for the panel. So to get us started, I'll now turn things over to Sara.
Hello, everyone. I have the joy of joining you today on behalf of the City of Los Angeles Office of Historic Resources. As Gennie mentioned, this is the office through which the idea of developing a woman's rights in Los Angeles historic context came from. Our office received a certified local government grant from the California Office of Historic Preservation to develop this context and identify extant associated properties. And the document was published in 2018. The women's rights in Los Angeles historic context is just one part of the Los Angeles citywide historic context statement, and we wanted to make sure that we shared that with you today. This context statement, or I should say the voluminous historic context statement, was created as part of Survey LA, the Los Angeles Historic Resources Survey, and it is made up of various themes, providing really a framework for identifying and evaluating historic resources within the city of Los Angeles. It covers the city's history and development through a broad range of architectural, social, ethnic, and cultural topics from 2 centuries of the city's history, starting in 1780 to roughly 1980. These themes are published on our website, and we welcome your curiosity in exploring the many themes, and we truly, truly encourage the use of these documents for community needs. But they are technical documents, and they were created for the purposes of nominations and identifying historic properties that may be associated to specific parts of our history. We do, again, encourage that these documents be used for those purposes, that these sites that have been identified as being significant, that they formally receive some sort of designation, whether it be at the local, state, or at the national level. So with that said, I'll go ahead and have the podium get passed on over to Christine Lazzaretto, who is with Historic Resources Group, the consultant firm that was selected to help us bring this project to life.
Thank you, Sara. Now let's see on advance the slides, and I will just start with my introduction. Good afternoon. I'm Christine with Historic Resources Group, as Sara just mentioned. We prepared the Women's Rights Historic Context Statement for the city, and again, that was the main goal was to help with the identification of potentially significant sites associated with women's rights in the city. You're going to hear momentarily from Sian, who worked with us on this project and was the primary author of the context narrative. So we worked together with Sian and other HRG staff to help document specific sites that Sian identified in her research. And we were looking at properties dating from the early suffrage movement in the city through second wave feminism in the 1960s and 1970s. Since this is a city planning project, a nexus between the history and the story of these people and places and the built environment itself was an important goal. So again, we're trying to help the city with future planning efforts, help people identify those sites that are eligible for historic designation for an association with this context. It's great that the city commissions studies like this. We feel that the entire Survey LA historic context statement is helping to create a broader understanding of our history. And the subject matter of this one was very exciting for all of us to work on. Before I turn it over to Sian to share her research with all of you, we agreed that we wanted to take a minute to acknowledge that just like anything else, the women's movement was and is large and complex, and so is the telling of that story. Feminist history acknowledges that the forms of oppression experienced by white, middle, and upper class, and primarily heterosexual women who were leading the charge for the suffrage movement in the 19th century was very different than the issues experienced by women of other races and sexual orientations. And actually the 100th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment reminds us that despite what a significant milestone that was in the history of women's rights, there was nothing in that amendment that addressed voter suppression and the extensive voter suppression experienced by African American women who came out to exercise their new right. In addition, uncovering contemporary accounts related to women's history is challenging. News accounts not only underreported women's history in general, but the history of women of color in the city specifically was underreported in contemporary news articles and other studies from the period. So it is our hope that this context statement will serve as a jumping off point for future scholarship on this topic and all of its diverse voices. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Sian to share some highlights of her research into this rich history and the important contributions of the women of Los Angeles in the fight for women's rights. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. Thanks to the Homestead Museum for having us. My buttons are a little sensitive here today. And also to the city for creating the opportunity for such an amazing project and to uncover so much of history that had been lost. I called this presentation Angels of Feminism because I think that not only is it a play on words about the City of the Angels, but it's truly the way we should think about these women through the century that we're going to talk about. And we're going to trace that work from suffrage and even a little bit prior, all the way up through 1980 and touch a little bit on recent times. I call it the hidden leadership of LA women in the women's rights movement because of exactly what Christine was talking about. When Christine was saying that, you know, it was an undertold story, it was absolutely true. Wasn't covered a lot in the paper of record at the time, the Los Angeles Times. We'll see how that plays itself out, but the short version of that is the Los Angeles Times staff and editorial staff was not very supportive of the topic of suffrage. So guess what? It didn't get a lot of ink, and the ink that it got was not always all that complimentary. Then you have some other added challenges. And frankly, I wasn't really sure what, if anything, we were going to uncover through this project, but I'd like to share the highlights of that research with you guys today. And I would, again, encourage you also to take a look at the context statement itself and read through that, because there's much more there than we can go through today. So we'll start here. We were talking a little bit about some of the challenges. One of the challenges is that even women who were active in the community basically before the turn of the century, they were very often not even covered with their own name. They would be covered by their husband's name. So this absolutely doubled the amount of research work that needed to be done. And as we said, they often weren't covered very much at all. And so I'd like to begin this presentation by showing you an example of one of the challenges that cropped up as we were doing this research. I set about to find the obituary of Dora Fellows Haynes. Dora was married to Mr. Haynes, and you may hear that name may ring a bell or be familiar because they are the benefactors of the Haynes Foundation that you often hear spoken about on NPR or public television. They're still active in doing social justice work. But Dora was a really, really important person. She came to Los Angeles like so many women did from the East Coast and from the Midwest. Just for example, she was a founding member of the Friday Morning Club, which we'll talk more about in just a minute. She's a founder of the Women's Athletic Club of Los Angeles. She established the Los Angeles branch of the Los Angeles League of Women Voters, and she was a hardcore suffragette. So it took a while to find her obituary, and there you can see it. Suffrage champion succumbs in 1934, blah, 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 talks all about that. And as is often the case when you do this kind of research, you try not to let it happen, but sometimes your eye wanders. And my eye wandered up farther up on the page to this particular headline. Benny's not dead in vain. Bold squirrel, traffic victim, to have memorial in tree he planted at the Biltmore. Now, for those of you who might be too young to remember actually physically holding a newspaper in your hand, one of the rules of newspaperdom was that the more important you were, the more ink you got, the more words you got, and the higher up on the page your story would be located. So I will now share the story of Benny because he clearly usurped the story of Dora. Benny the Bold, the popular squirrel who lost his life in traffic recently while crossing from Pershing Square to the entrance of the Biltmore, where he was storing his supply of nuts, is to have a memorial. The memorial will consist of a walnut tree grown from a nut, which the frisky little animal planted months ago in a tree tub at the Biltmore entrance. The tree is now 1 foot high, and at the request of the women of the Temple Baptist Church, the Park Commission will transplant it to Pershing Square. The women will place a small tablet bearing an affectionate inscription in front of the tree, hoping to create comfort and inspiration to the many friends of Benny, an unusually bold, intelligent, and active squirrel. And so after I stopped laughing when I saw this, I of course sent it to my colleagues at HRG. And fittingly, one of our funnier colleagues just responded with an email that said, perhaps if Dora had been bolder. So that is a fitting way to kind of start our exploration of women in Los Angeles. Although I feel it's important to also kind of begin by talking about how California women had some unique rights when it came to property, different than women in all other states across the country. So married women in California had the right to hold a separate property, any real or personal property, given them as a gift or inherited prior to or following their marriage. And again, this is not true in other states. If you inherited property and you were a married woman, it became the property of your husband, not your own personal property. But why did this happen here? Why was California unusual? Was it that it was so progressive? Certainly not at that time. It dates back to our Mexican heritage. So at the time of the California Constitutional Convention, the Californios insisted that what had long been part of the Mexican Civil Code should be written into the California Constitution so that it would protect the rights of California families, particularly as California women were increasingly marrying the Anglo pioneers. So thanks to our Mexican heritage and our Mexican roots, women in Los Angeles had something that virtually nobody else had. And I would just like to say that that only extended to property rights. For example, they could still be declared mentally incompetent and put in asylums, and that also did not extend to the guardianship of their children. But perhaps the most important figure in early suffrage was this woman in Los Angeles, Caroline Severance. She organized the first women's club in the nation in Boston in 1868. And then, like so many other women, she came to California. It was mostly for her husband's health. And in 1878, she organizes the first women's club here in Los Angeles. So the idea that women should educate themselves and take action was completely radical at the time. The newspaper called for the local clergy to pray for these women, that they would see the error of their ways, and that certainly this would not sustain itself. But it did, at least for a while. The first meeting of the Los Angeles Women's Club was at El Nido in 1878. This was Severance's home, El Nido, right down near USC, and unfortunately that has been razed. But while at El Nido, the ladies worded a constitutional amendment giving women the right to vote. Now, Caroline, again, had been a big suffragette player on the East Coast. So Caroline forwarded it to her friend, Susan B. Anthony, the social reformer and renowned women's rights activist. Anthony, in turn, sent it to California Senator Aaron Sargent, who introduced it on the floor of Congress. And it was this very bill, called the Susan B. Anthony Amendment, which would be introduced in every congressional session from that year until finally women got the right to vote on a national level in 1920. And so several of Severance's local biographers at the time confirmed that Severance and her colleagues were responsible for the amendment's wording. Anthony, however, makes no mention of Severance or her friends. And this also brings up one of the challenges here is that a lot of the history of the suffrage movement was either written by women on the East Coast or, with all due respect, women in Northern California who really weren't looking to share the history that we had in Los Angeles. So Severance was really the backbone of the organization, and unfortunately, she returned to Boston several times over the next 15 years or so for extended periods. And every time she went home to Boston and stayed for an extended period, the women's club collapsed. And then every time she returned from Boston, she revived it. So here we have on El Nido stationery, Caroline Severance's Civic Creed. And I'll just read a short passage of it to give you the flavor of it. It says, "For the long work day, for the taxes we pay, for the laws we obey, we want something to say, by the ballot way, and without delay." So around this time, a slew of professional women were coming to Los Angeles and became active with Caroline Severance. Here's just a couple of them. On the left, that's Elizabeth Fullinsby. She was a very early female physician in Los Angeles. She taught pediatrics at USC and was the first woman on the LA County Medical Association. On the right-hand side, you have Clara Shortridge Foltz, which the name may be familiar to some of you who had the unfortunate task of doing jury duty at some point over the last several years because the county courthouse is named after Clara. But Clara was the first female lawyer on the West Coast. Her husband left her with 5 kids, and she ended up suing Hastings College for discrimination because she wanted to attend and become a lawyer, and she won. So she was also the first female deputy district attorney in Los Angeles. So back and forth goes Caroline Severance, back to Boston. Things fall apart. She comes back, she revives it. She goes back to Boston. They fall apart again. And in 1891, she returns from LA to Boston and she formed the Friday Morning Club of Los Angeles. And this time it was different. It became a real center of united thought and action for women who wished to learn about and discuss the vital subjects of the day. It was an assemblage of the most progressive women in the city. And it became a vital force in a wide range of topics, from sanitation to child labor laws, and then ultimately suffrage. This is a shot of Caroline Severance laying the cornerstone of the Friday Morning Club building on Figueroa on September the 14th, 1899. And here's just a little glimpse at what that building looked like. As you can see, it was a beautiful Mission Revival style clubhouse. Which was, of course, a popular style of the time. There's a distinctive mission-style bell tower element on the second floor, kind of on the right-hand side, depending upon how your Zoom boxes are stacked up at this point. And then there's also these beautiful arched colonnades, again, evoking the mission. Now, unfortunately, we pretty much lost this building as well. There were elements of it that were I don't want to say dismembered, but that were taken apart and were sold to another women's group across town. But there is no building that looks quite like this or as beautiful as or as important as this building was. Now, I mentioned that Severance, was from the East Coast, and as a result, she had a lot of clout. And she used that clout to bring really important speakers in from across the country. People like Susan B. Anthony, of course, the leading women's rights activist in the nation. Women like Reverend Anna Howard Shaw, another national leader in the suffrage movement. Charlotte Perkins Gilman, American novelist, writer, poet, lecturer on social reform. Julia Ward Howe, who wrote Battle Hymn of the Republic, was an abolitionist and an activist for women's suffrage. So Los Angeles women were literally getting the best and the brightest minds that suffrage had to offer from across the United States, all due to Caroline Severance. Now, on a somewhat parallel path, temperance, which is of course the outlawing of the sale of liquor, was a movement gaining steam around this time and offered opportunities for women to organize. The Women's Christian Temperance Union, the WCTU, as you can see them here, of Southern California was established in 1882. It was a growing and popular movement, and there were a lot of smaller chapters that ended up splitting off. So by 1886, Los Angeles had its very own WCTU, and that's these fine women here. There were 14 neighborhood WCTUs established between 1887 and 1888. So there's like a Boyle Heights chapter, and there's a university chapter from down near USC. And by the time we reach 1890, there are 1,000 collective members of the WTCU here in Los Angeles. Now, a lot of people talk about the temperance movement in particular as a movement about moral superiority. You know, the old like, oh, you know, you shouldn't drink because it's a terrible thing. It's a moral judgment. But I think it's important to take just a step back from that for a moment to talk about what the actual practical effects were of alcoholism for women at that point. And you know, it would be that men who drank too much took out the bad behaviors on women that they were involved with. It was a gateway for physical and mental abuse. It was a gateway for, as I said, you know, violence against women. It was a gateway for child abuse and very often for poverty. And so I think if we think about this again, as Christine said, not that everything is monolithic, that the temperance movement wasn't just a moral imperative, but it actually was trying to solve some very practical problems that women were experiencing at the time. It was popular enough that they gathered enough members and support money to build this, what everyone used to refer to as the Temperance Temple on Broadway. It was built in 1890. And it served as the meeting house and offices, of course, for the LA chapter of the WCTU. It also offered meeting rooms to other women's organizations and rooms where some of these smaller neighborhood chapters could also assemble and meet. Very often, it would also include these offices would include like a reading room, which would offer men in particular a place to go to pass time instead of going to a bar, for example. So the Temperance Temple was built in 1890, but it was also raised, I believe, as a result of the 1933 earthquake, but it was raised fairly early on in the 20th century. So by 1894, suffrage was really gaining momentum, and women started organizing around the belief that in 1896, 2 years later, there would be a constitutional amendment for that state legislative session. And the Los Angeles Women's Suffrage Association, which also, of course, Caroline Severance had a role in founding, called a convention of all Southern California suffrage societies, because there was a whole lot of different small groups active in the movement. In November of 1896, when the election happened, the amendment was defeated by 26,746 votes. Bummer. But what's important when you delve down into the data a little bit on this is that the majority of votes for suffrage came from Southern California. Los Angeles County gave it the largest favorable majority. And what that means is if we had been our own state or our own area without Northern California, we would have had the right to vote as women in 1896 in Los Angeles. There's been a lot of postmortem analysis done on the 1896 election, and the general consensus is that the San Francisco suffragists really didn't do themselves any favor because they ended up aligning themselves very strongly with the temperance movement in Northern California. And that ended up organizing the opposition of the Liquor Dealers League. They also did not involve low-income women. But it's also just, it may seem obvious, but I think it's worth stating that in order to get the right to vote, women had to get men to give them the right to vote. And so, whereas the Los Angeles suffragists were working more with men, and they were working with low-income populations, which we'll talk a little bit more about in a moment, that wasn't happening in San Francisco. And all the men thought that if they gave women the right to vote, they would not be able to purchase alcohol anymore. So we didn't get it in 1896. We were going to have to wait a while. And frankly, it really killed that loss killed the momentum of the suffrage movement for many years. But sooner or later, progressives in Southern California particularly, women of color, as I said, and men all started to form stronger connections within the Los Angeles suffrage movement. Fortunately, we have, in addition to the Los Angeles Times, we have the newspaper across town, the Los Angeles Herald, which was a vital resource for this research and this project, because they were pro-suffrage and they covered much more of the activity that was going on. And they covered the positive movement in Los Angeles. So for example, it was through the Herald that we learned about Maria de Lopez, who was the first woman to make a Spanish language speech on suffrage at a rally in the Plaza in Los Angeles. We also learned of the work of Charlotta Spears Bass. Charlotta was the first woman in the US to run an African-American newspaper. It was called the California Eagle, or sometimes just remembered as the Eagle. Even after we attained suffrage here in California, she continued to publish pro-suffrage editorials that supported suffrage as a means for social change to boost the national movement. And keeping in mind, she was also promoting continually the rights of Blacks to vote generally, and again, as Christine talked about, how to navigate against voter suppression. I think it's also worth mentioning, given the historic events of this last week, that Charlotta Bass was the first African-American woman to run for president as an independent late in her life. I believe it was in the 70s. But it just shows you what an amazing woman Charlotta Bass was. So the early 1900s were, as I said, a period of momentum building for suffrage. We had to kind of undo and lick our wounds from the loss and move forward. There were dozens of rallies, marches, picnics, gatherings, and such. Here in this undated photo, we have suffragettes marching in downtown Los Angeles. And they continued their work even after the important work here in California came to its conclusion. And so here you have the LA Herald, and as you can see, the headline says, "Woman suffrage wins by 2051." So in October of 1911, 9 years ahead of the national right, it was once again the Southern California voters, not the Northern California ones, that pushed the suffrage measure over the edge. And so here you can see that the Herald is celebrating, the women are above the fold, everyone's happy. Not so much over at the Los Angeles Times, where we have a somewhat less enthusiastic acknowledgement there. Women's suffrage probably wins after all, with this photo of a male religious figure, which I think is a somber religious figure, expressing some displeasure. Now, the period from the 1890s through the 1920s generally is referred to as the progressive era. And I think it's important to remember that suffrage was part of that, but there were all kinds of work being done in an effort towards civic reform. Another delightful discovery we made as part of this project was that we discovered that Los Angeles had the first uniformed policewoman in the nation. That was Alice Stebbins Wells, who we see right here. She developed the City Mothers Bureau, which was a safe space where concerned parents could basically go about their daughters who might be getting into trouble. They didn't feel like they wanted to take their daughters to the regular police. And so Alice established the City Mothers Bureau to provide a buffer and a service and support system for girls. So this woman has done a lot for the girls and women of Los Angeles in the 20th century. Now, the securing of the vote and the ensuing prosperity of the 1920s kind of ushered in a golden age of women clubs and organizations. It was a period when they embarked on building programs, capital campaigns, and one of my favorite examples of this is the Women's Athletic Club in downtown Los Angeles, another building that unfortunately is no longer there. It's an exceptional $750,000 Italian Renaissance Revival style building designed by the architects Allison and Allison. Here's a shot of the interior. Now, not only did the women raise money on their own, they raised through a capital campaign to build this project. This project is notable for the fact that it was the largest project that had ever been funded, to ever receive funding that was basically headed by women. It was the women's banking department at the Los Angeles branch of the Bank of Italy, which of course became Bank of America. And they helped raise the money, a rather substantial amount of money, because the women did not raise $750,000. And it was through the Bank of Italy that the financial arrangement was made for these women. And the facilitator of that was Grace Stormer. She was the first woman in the US elected as the secretary of the California State Legislature in 1919. She served in that position for about a year, and then she left that position to go become vice president at the Bank of Italy, where she ran the women's banking department in Los Angeles. And just as it sounds, a women's banking department was a very progressive division. It was not common in banks across the United States, and it specialized, as I said, in helping women to obtain financing. Grace was also the president of the National Association for Bank Women and Business and Professional Women's Club of Los Angeles. So she was important in many, many, many organizations in Los Angeles. So here's a shot of the lovely patio area. In addition to athletic facilities, the building had residential offerings, large banquet facilities, and a dining room for women. It provided meeting space for several women's organizations that didn't have their own buildings, like the California League of Women's Voters and the League of Business and Professional Women. Here's another example of this sort of golden age of the clubs. This one is still here with us and thriving on Wilshire Boulevard. Many of you may know the Wilshire Ebell Club building. And again, this is right in the boom time, right before the Great Depression. The Ebell Club, however, was far more social than political. So, you know, it's kind of the social equivalent, if you will, of the Friday morning club. When the Depression hit in 1929, club membership of all kinds, as well as women's club membership, became really a luxury, and the sort of marked the end of the golden age of women's clubs. So after the Depression was over, we weathered the 30s, and in the early 1940s, obviously, World War II was upon us. Women were replacing men at all kinds of jobs. And here we have just 3 women bike messengers who ran intercompany communications between the company headquarters at the Garland building and 3 LA area plants. So for those of you who might not be old enough to remember anything other than email, this was a way that people were getting important information and memos and such by these wonderful women riding their motorcycles throughout the city. Here we see women reporting to work at Douglas Aircraft in Santa Monica. And here, and a couple of shots, which I just couldn't resist putting in because they're so beautiful. This series of photos of women Rosie the Riveters that were working at Douglas Aircraft in Long Beach. This was a group of women who really found fulfillment and success through employment, and they certainly found more financial independence. It's important to remember at this time that really the only types of jobs that had been open to women were librarians, teachers, nurses, or secretaries. And in particular, the defense industry jobs opened up a world of opportunity for women of color. A number of African-American women came from the South, and prior to coming to work in the defense industry, they had only been able to work in jobs as, you know, domestics, as cooks, or as housekeepers, all kinds of menial labor. So this really presented an opportunity for them to become more independent and financially independent as well. Just to kind of put this in perspective, by VED, Victory Over Europe Day, 19 million women were employed in the industrial workforce. And when the war was over, all of those women were terminated. a 1944 survey of Lockheed workers here in Southern California found that 48% of the women wanted to remain in their jobs after the war was over. They were finding it very satisfying. But the men were coming back, and all the defense plants and all the other manufacturing companies laid off all the women so that they could open up jobs for returning GIs. And so then came what is often referred to as the return to normalcy, which was really, a conservative period for women's rights. Here we see a group of the 1955 competitors for the Mrs. San Fernando Valley title. I think you can just feel like they all have a meatloaf recipe in their pockets that they are willing to share. But it certainly is in direct contrast to those women that we saw, earning a living, gaining skills, and gaining independence. But things started to change in the 60s. And probably the biggest influence was the publication of the Feminine Mystique, Betty Friedan's book in 1963. It ignited what we know today to be second wave feminism. And I want to read you just a clip or a passage from the Feminine Mystique. The American woman, buried in her dishpans, has been brainwashed into believing that the only commitment for women is the fulfillment of their own femininity. The first step in finding oneself is to recognize that housework is not a career, but something that must be done as quickly and efficiently as possible. The second step is to see marriage as it really is, not necessarily as the final fulfillment of life. Men are not holding back women in America. It's our own self-degradation. So those words in that book inspired a new generation of women to reconsider the circumstances that they found themselves in. I'm sorry to say that Betty Friedan passed away in 2006. And that's a good segue to talk just a little more about process in terms of the research of the context statement. One of the things that we wanted to do was because we knew it would be under-researched and underreported, we wanted to reach out to many of these women who had participated in the feminist movements, and to talk to them, to get oral histories from them. And it was really depressing because I made my list of people, and as I went through it, so many of them had already passed away. I was able to locate a couple of people, some important players in second wave feminism. And I made outreach to them, and I found them just delighted and so willing to share their memories and their stories, which was so important for us in terms of helping to identify some of the locations and places that were important to second wave feminism. As you can imagine, a lot of these organizations were meeting in people's homes, just like this is a National Now Task Force meeting at the home of the then president. And that's the kind of thing that doesn't get documented anywhere. They were also very generous with many of their photographs and much of their ephemera. So we've included some of that here, and I salute all those women. So one thing to consider about second wave feminism is that it generally split into two fronts. So on one front, you've got Betty Friedan, who established the National Organization of Women, or NOW, which pushed really hard for the Equal Rights Amendment. And generally, that section of the feminists were generally white women. They were well educated. Here we have Gloria Steinem speaking to a rally of women and some men there at Cal State Long Beach. And of course, the campuses were a really important place for this movement to build momentum. But the other half of the movement was a more radical women's liberation movement, which pushed equality to include reproductive rights, sexuality, financial independence, and violence against women. The latter was typically younger, and it was more diverse, and established safe space for what they called consciousness raising sessions, where participants explored the connections between their own personal experiences and larger social and political structures. A great example of this is the Women's Center on Crenshaw. So this humble little building here was the location of the very first Women's Center. The founders of the Women's Center specifically picked this residential duplex location to rent because they felt it didn't look institutional, it felt kind of homey, it was going to be staffed with women, and it was critical to have a place that was a tangible way of documenting and tangibilizing the needs of women. And so they founded the Women's Center in January of 1970. They, of course, had a center newsletter. And by 1972, that same newsletter had 2,700 subscribers, the largest of any feminist publication in the United States. There were subscribers far beyond the confines of Southern California, far beyond the confines of California itself. And it eventually morphed into what became sister newspaper. So the Women's Center was also important because it was the location of Women's Self-Help Clinic 1. And Self-Help Clinic 1 was the model for the national women's self-help movement. But just to illustrate the importance of and the foresight that the city of Los Angeles had to do this project to learn more about women's history in Los Angeles, I want to share this photo, because this is what the Women's Center looks like today on Crenshaw. And this is exactly the kind of resource or building that if you just drive past it and you're looking to find something that you think might be of historical or cultural significance, you would never know that Triple Crown Car Rental, and I'm pretty sure the people that own Triple Crown Car Rental don't know it either, that this was such a critical resource for second wave feminism in Los Angeles. It's also an example of a place that is a resource with a very difficult history because of its association with the women's self-help movement, which empowered women to take command back over their own bodies and to be a part of the growing abortion rights movement. So I mentioned I had reached out to some of the second wave feminists, and it involved a lot of cold calling and letters to addresses I didn't know if I would ever get a return call from. And I'm so delighted to tell you that at one point I was sitting in my kitchen and the phone rang, and I picked up the phone and the woman said, "Hi, this is Carol Downer." Now, Carol Downer's on the right-hand side of this image, and Carol Downer is the tireless abortion rights activist and the founder of the self-help clinic movement that you just saw. Started off in that very humble residential building and then moved to ultimately 2 or 3 other sites in Los Angeles as it grew and expanded over the course of decades. Carol was sought out from people all across the country who wanted to start women's self-help clinics in their towns and neighborhoods. They organized an entire conference to bring all of those women out to Los Angeles to see what Carol had done and to learn about best practices. So I was so honored to be able to speak with Carol, to thank her for everything that she had done for women, and again to learn all of the important things that she had to say about her time here in Los Angeles. So the Women's Center on Crenshaw, in addition to all of that, it was also the location of the meetings of the Gay Women's Liberation, or the Gay Liberation Front. So in 1971, prominent lesbian feminist members of NOW, including Eve Norman, called for a vote that lesbian opposition was really truly a feminist issue. The National Organization of Women had been sort of skirting this issue. They didn't want to get derailed from the ERA, which they felt was their primary motivator. And I don't think that they really wanted to dilute that cause. But I'm pleased to say that through, again, the Los Angeles chapter, the lesbian feminist movement was acknowledged as a critical and an important part of second wave feminism. And after that, lesbian feminists had a much greater role in the movement nationally. So I mentioned that by most accounts, the NOW community was not terribly diverse, and women of color had a really hard time finding their own place within it. And it's important to acknowledge that women of color often came to the women's rights movement from a very different perspective. They came most often from a civil rights perspective first. And so one example of this is the Chicana feminism movement, which evolved out of the Chicano movement, and in particular, a very strong Chicano studies program and feminist studies program at Cal State Long Beach. And a similar thing happened in the African American community as well. They came at it from a civil rights perspective as well. Now, another important contribution of LA women to second wave feminism was the artist Judy Chicago. The feminist art movement grew out of a 1970 art show that the LA County Museum of Art put on, that of course featured 17 male artists and no women artists. Well, in Chicago, or in response to that, Judy Chicago founded what she called the Feminist Art Project. She was a teacher at Cal State Fresno at the time. And that was the first program in the United States to combine feminism with art. She relocated that program down here to Southern California to Cal Arts. And you can see some of the participants in that program there beneath Judy. And in 1973, Judy Chicago, Sheila Levant de Bretteville, and art historian Arlene Raven founded the Feminist Studio Workshop, the first independent school for women artists. First, they leased space out of what was then the kind of Chouinard Art School building, because it was owned by Cal Arts, and that was an easy place for them to get space. But in 1975, they moved to the Women's Building in downtown LA, and that became a real hub for the women's movement. In addition to the studio and a printing studio, it housed a lot of feminist businesses, and I'm so pleased that it was designated as a city landmark in 2018, right about the same time that we finished the women's rights context. And so one of the other things that we learned about through this research was the idea of feminist businesses at all, frankly, and how important they were. This is in Westwood. This is actually the site of the very first and most important branch of Sisterhood Bookstore, which is no longer there. And it opened, as I said, in Westwood in 1972, and they had subsequent other branch locations, one in the Women's Building that I just showed you on the previous slide, and another one on Ventura Boulevard in the Valley. And feminist bookstores were not only important as a resource for literature and books, but they also, again, provided a gathering space, a tangible place to network. There were bulletin boards there. People could offer support services. If a woman was being abused and she didn't know where to go, they would give her resources on safe houses that she could go to, which were really just kind of starting to become a thing at this time. But more than just feminist bookstores, other feminist businesses included travel agencies, the LA Feminist Federal Credit Union, which kind of takes us back to the Women's Banking Department in its own way. But here the Feminist Credit Union provided loans to women without their own credit histories, because they often had been married and then divorced, and then as a result had no credit history of their very own and couldn't establish themselves. And as you probably know, that despite much work by NOW and other organizations, the ERA was never ratified. But I do like to think that the 2016 Women's Rally and the Me Too movement are what some refer to as third wave feminism. Some call it fourth wave feminism. As with all things, it depends upon exactly who you ask. But I know one thing to be true, that Los Angeles's ongoing interest in women's rights was on clear display when on this day 750,000 women protested in downtown Los Angeles. It was the largest women's rights demonstration and protest in the country. And we've continued to lead in women's rights. I think we've only had a short time here to hit the highlights, but I hope you'll agree that we have a storied heritage in the area of women's rights and suffrage and protecting women. And we're very fortunate that the city engaged on this thoughtful project to ensure that all the angels of feminism from the 1890s to ultimately at some point 2016 are seen, heard, and celebrated. So thank you very much.
All right, thank you so much, Sian. You gave us a lot to think about. We're gonna now open it up for questions. If anyone watching would like to ask any questions, please you're able to do so by just typing in the Q&A box there. If you're watching on Facebook Live, you'll be able to just post those in the comment section and we'll ask them for you now. But I would like to get us started by asking Sara, if you could talk to us a little bit about why the city of Los Angeles decided to have a document like this, as well as the other surveys that were created.
Thank you. That's a really good question. The historic context statement was primarily, like I said earlier, created for the purposes of Survey LA, which is the Los Angeles Historic Resources Survey that really went about looking at all parcels within the city to identify which properties may be eligible for designations, which ones would even merit an additional review in the event that there would be a project proposed. So what that created is properties that would, one, merit an additional review if there were to be a project proposed, but also what that process did is identify properties that are eligible for designation, which then allows communities to take charge and nominate resources important to the community. Part of developing the historic context statement included developing themes associated with particular communities, ethnic groups, and it was right in getting close to the completion of what is the historic context statement now that from our office we would brainstorm and try to identify themes that perhaps are missing or that are covered throughout the context statement but not necessarily discussed in a focused way. And Janet Hansen, who was with the Office of Historic Resources at the time, she said, you know, we haven't discussed women's rights. And so it was really her idea and her ability to synthesize all of what we had already identified and initiated. And that was, it's sort of picking out what topics need to be discussed to bring forward and highlight. And so we had done several ethnic-focused context statements, but covering women's rights and just that entire history of Los Angeles. And I'm assuming and guessing that it was also likely because she knew a bit of this and how it had not been discovered or discussed and what is extant, what has been lost. And so that's really how it came to the women's rights context. But really, that's how we've been approaching the context statement throughout. And as I mentioned before, the context statement and all of the volumes that compose it have an end date of 1980. And the idea is that as time progresses, that we're able to revisit these themes or new themes to highlight and essentially continue to complete what the context would be for us to evaluate our own history and the resources that surround us, and just socially as well as design-wise. I hope that answers the question.
Absolutely, it does. And we just got a question in from Judith, who asks, since it is included as potentially being significant, is there any movement on getting the Westwood Sisterhood bookstore site recognized as a historic site? This brought back many happy memories of shopping and connecting there.
You know, the resources that are identified through these documents, it's possible that there may be some movement in the community to get these resources designated. Designations that are initiated by the Office of Historic Resources are quite rare. If anything, they would be initiated by way of the Cultural Heritage Commission. In the past, and this was years ago, I think the commission proposed the designation of the LA bridges. So if there were to be a movement that would be city initiated, it would be through the Cultural Heritage Commission and it would be something that they would propose. But at this time, there aren't any city initiated designations for city monuments, but this information is there for the taking, and it definitely is there to be used by the community. And There is some technical support that is provided by our office in helping community members put together nominations if this is what is desired.
That's fantastic. That's good to know. If people have sites that they're very interested in learning more about the history of, or getting that historic marker or something like that, this is a great resource as a place to start. This is a question that's kind of up for all three of you. So what is the process of creating a survey like this? What questions did the city really want to have answered in this kind of long continued timeline? And did the project take you into directions that maybe you weren't previously thinking it would?
I think primarily, and Sian definitely underscored this point, that properties that are more significant for their cultural associations, that's something that you can't tell by reviewing it or walking by it. You really have to know the history, and not necessarily, it's not so much the building that's the significant part, but the associated history. And I meant significant, architecturally significant is what I meant. So that's definitely what we aim to uncover, because in all of what was Survey LA, much of the surveying was done from the public right of way. And though there was some research done before surveyors went into communities, sometimes that rich cultural significance wasn't readily available. And that's what oftentimes takes more research. And that's why there are these very focused context statements that are created.
And I would say, just to add on to that a little bit, in the case of this study, as we've been talking about today, there wasn't a lot of information out there already sort of in the public realm about this. So there are other types of sites that fall into that same category Sarah was just talking about, where when you're driving by down the street, they may not necessarily jump out at you as potentially significant, but a pretty quick search kind of starts to uncover that history. In cases like this, where it really took Sian talking to these women and figuring out where they lived and, you know, understanding where some of those early meeting places were, that wasn't stuff you can find just by kind of quickly looking it up. So these focus theme studies really help to bring out a lot of that, you know, not just history that's not easily recognizable, but really kind of hidden and unknown history.
Yeah, I would just add to that I didn't mention it in the presentation, but one of the really valuable resources that I frankly sort of stumbled upon is down in South Central Los Angeles, and I wish I could remember the exact name of it. I'll try and Google it when I'm not talking here. But there is a social justice museum archive, which is a really nice way of saying it's an industrial building with a lot of boxes of junk that some well-meaning human being, and thank goodness he did, started collecting from offices and garages from all over the Southern California, having to do with, you know, social justice movements. And when I contacted them, they said, well, you know, we don't have anything cataloged, but we have these 5 boxes, and you're welcome to come down there and look at them. And because unfortunately the archive is not, you know, well funded, you don't have a lot of the red tape you might have at a really well-blown academic archive. And I went down there with my little brown bag lunch, and she brought out 5 boxes of junk, which is just a joy for me. And included in there were, for example, a bunch of newsletters from the Women's Center. And it talked about who was teaching at the Women's Center. And then there was a list of all the places that these women lived, all the teachers at the Women's Center. So once again, I was able then to figure out, oh, these are the movers and shakers. Here's where they lived. Here's what they were doing. And, you know, we never would have been able to do that through the Los Angeles Times. So it was a great journey.
Just for clarification, you were speaking of the Southern California Library on Vermont?
Yes, yes. It has a somewhat tortured name, but yes, that's it.
And this is more of a personal question for the three of you. Is there a particular person, story, or place that was discussed in the survey that is particularly memorable or kind of stays with you, and why?
I have one that's just sort of a personal favorite based on the way they talked about it, and it was the the home that Sian showed a photo of a meeting of the NOW organization in their backyard, but it's the house of two women who were part of the lesbian feminist movement, and they referred to it as a center of rabble rousing, which I just thought was a great way to describe, you know, kind of a lighthearted way to describe obviously the very serious issues that they were addressing. But I just sort of loved that, you know, their house was the center for rabble rousing for women in the 1970s. And then the other one for me, which is just sort of a heartbreaking thing, was, you know, learning all that we learned about Caroline Severance through all of Sian's research, and the fact that her house was demolished just sort of kills me. And just, you know, just for everyone to know, it was demolished in 1950, so it wasn't anything recent. So, you know, I guess fortunately for those of us working in preservation now, it wasn't an immediate loss that we like just missed it by a couple years by not knowing all of this history. And I will say, I guess on the positive front, the building that replaced it was founded by Spencer Tracy's wife, Louise. I didn't want to not say her name in a talk about women. They had a son who was deaf, and they established a school and support center for families of deaf children. So I guess it's a good evolution in terms of support for families and women, but I sort of still can't believe that we lost her house.
I would just throw out that I was so delighted to find out about Alice Stebbins Wells and being the first, you know, women policewoman in the country. I often don't think of LAPD sometimes in the finest or most groundbreaking historic ways, except in the negative. So I was all for Alice leading the way to put the positive light on the police. And I think that what she really did for young women and girls is an important part of the story that I underplayed a little bit here in this. But it's always like the young troubled girls, right? You know, and so they get sent off somewhere into horrifying conditions, which don't do anything to address whatever needs, emotional, mental, physical support needs that they might have. And she really made a one-woman attempt to change all of that. So I think that she paid it forward in a really meaningful way.
I wanted to say that I had a personal connection to the Women's Building. In my time as an undergrad, I interned and worked in close quarters and out of Linda Vallejo's studio in Topanga, and I worked with her closely and on a couple of projects. And I would often hear from her how she worked at the Women's Building and her activities in the east side of Los Angeles in the 70s and 80s. And for me to be in the Office of Historic Resources years after having worked with her and just having that sort of history come full circle and be there and be able to share with her that the building was designated was something really neat for me to personally experience, and to see all of this history has been made by women who continue to pave the road for other women has been amazing.
That is fantastic. And Christine, I was about to fall on the floor when you had mentioned Louise Tracy and the Tracy School. I actually, just to share a little side note, I have a connection to that. My parents are deaf, and my grandmother actually had a correspondence with the Tracy School. So to know that that is part of this longer, this site was once part of a much longer history is very, very, I'm very happy to hear. So that is fantastic. I had no idea that was going to come out today. Sara, how do you think this survey can be used to inform future projects potentially by the city, and also maybe also help with some civic discourse in regards to women's rights?
Well, with regards to women's rights and what the purview is of the Office of Historic Resources is mainly holding this information in the event that a project is proposed. But more importantly, what we've discussed in the Office of Historic Resources is how to bring these documents, not just the women's rights context, but all of the contexts, and have these documents be used for what they're intended to be used for, so that we can initiate, if not through the office, but more so through community members, so that we get activity and have community members really speak for the resources that are in the communities. context statement and this method of documenting resources really creates a shortcut for designations as well, because then the onus of the applicant to express or document that context, that history, it's not there anymore because it's there through the context statement. So it's really, it creates a shortcut because then the focus would be on the resource specifically to do the research on that. And it creates an avenue to make this what has become a more professionalized nomination process, if you will. It creates a shortcut and makes it easier. So the Office of Historic Resources and the Planning Department and that's part of the reason why the Office of Historic Resources was created, is to have this information, but also create more activity in the community so that communities can speak for their resources as well.
Yeah, and that's fantastic. One of the comments that we got on Facebook Live from Annette, she says that it's so interesting that without this survey, that this history could all potentially be lost.
That's correct. And when there are projects proposed in sites where we have identified a property, a site, or a place that's significant, there is an evaluation that needs to take place to identify whether or not the property can be designated and if a project can be proposed and approved on site. And what that also creates is a discussion of maybe it's not eligible for a designation, but what other way can it be recognized? Not having properties get listed on a national register or as a city landmark, that's one avenue. There are many ways that properties can be called out, memorialized in the community, if you will, and designation is one aspect, one avenue, but just having the information available creates those conversations and discussions, and can also create community initiated recognition programs as well. Markers, walking tours, what have you.
Yeah, and it's really important to, I think, also for people to kind of realize that history really does surround us. It's not something that just happened and occasionally gets written about or put in a book or something you study in a class, but it really is something that is in your environment and that you may come in contact with in ways that you had no idea were possible. This is for Christine and Sian. Were there any particular challenges you faced in compiling the information? Sian, you talked to, it was a bit difficult to find, especially the second wave feminists and who is still around and able to kind of share some of their history. Were there other particular challenges, especially in researching women's history, that you faced?
Well, I think there was one thing that I learned, which is in of itself a challenge. So a lot of these early suffragists, they all lived kind of down near USC. You know, it wasn't just, they were Caroline's neighbors, because that was a very expensive neighborhood, very, you know, a wealthy neighborhood. And as the university expanded over time, it of course encroached into the neighborhood. And we've determined that there were quite a few houses that were moved. And so I believe that there may be out there more houses of these important women that we talked about, who were just simply moved to another location. And as you can imagine, maybe the documentation of that happening is not all that great in like 1911. And so I would just think that I have a feeling that it won't be too long before someone will, you know, look at some permits and say, oh, this house was moved from, you know, XYZ place to XYZ place, and then realize that it was the house of an important woman from the suffrage movement. So we may not have lost them all completely. There may still be more out there, but that's a little bit challenging for us to track at this point. It's going to happen kind of bubbling up from the community.
And I guess the good news is we now have this information, right, to be able to tie it to some of these places. And, you know, I underscore what Sian just said. So our job was to sift through the information that Sian was compiling. And in a lot of cases, you know, news accounts and other things will just say, you know, they met at Mrs. Smith's house, or they went to the such and such place on the corner of X street and Y street. And so we had to figure out, okay, was that street, you know, a lot of street names change over time. So that's also always a challenge. Anybody who's listening who does historical research knows this, that the street names morphed over time. And so sussing out what it was called at that time versus what it is now, and then figuring out what corner did they mean, and does this building sort of look like it could have dated to the early 20th century, and sort of, you know, like I said at the beginning of all of this, creating that nexus between the historic research Sian is doing and what the planning department needs in order to make some decisions and you know, figure out how this impacts the built environment is always, it's a fun challenge, but it's very challenging for sure.
And I think it's worth underscoring that these documents, as well as Survey LA and all of what was identified, is not the end all and be all. These documents and this framework is really meant to aid in the evaluation in what's already identified, and also aid in the identifying of other resources that perhaps were not uncovered through the process and the development of the context, and as well as the actual survey process. It leaves the door open, and part of the reason why the context statement is meant to be extended over time.
Yeah, exactly. And I would say when you're looking through these documents, you'll see places where we'll leave incomplete information, or we'll footnote and say, at this time, we're not quite sure if this is the right building, or we're not quite sure where this is, but we want to leave those little nuggets of, you know, the research we've done to date that will hopefully help someone else in the future maybe actually, you know, figure out the answer to some of these questions.
And that's fantastic. And I just want to share with you, all three of you, that your work is not in vain. Some of the chat comments here have been just saying a huge thank you to all the panelists for such an informative talk, that they're a big fan of the Survey LA reports and they consult them often. Another person, Judith, says that they have been working on a project about LA women, and it's been so incredibly helpful in terms of their research. And that actually brings me to my last question. How do you think we can continue to share stories about women in Los Angeles? What do you think how do we keep this conversation going?
Well, I think what you've done today in gathering us all together is a really great step. You know, I think sometimes after we complete one of these documents, it's, you know, very often a multi-year process. Is just like, oh, I'm done. Thank you. I'm so happy to be done. But, you know, really that's just the beginning of the work that we really could and probably should be doing, which is, you know, increasing awareness of them, talking in forum for like this one, and hopefully getting together in a space. If we can ever do that again, that would be really great too. But I think that, you know, keeping the conversation going and also paying it forward, because we did have to stop at around 1979, but that's by no means the end of the story. So.
Absolutely.
And I would just say also that, you know, talking to more diverse groups and trying to layer into this history more of those stories that we weren't able to uncover for this study. You know, like I was talking about at the beginning, women's suffrage meant different things to different groups of women, and all of that work is still ongoing. So I think there's still a ton of opportunities for us to keep this dialogue and make this study better and make the general study of women's history more complete all the way around.
And for me, the big thing that I wanted to get out today is that these are really tools. You know, these become marching orders for us to take action and recognize and nominate properties that are significant to us in our communities, and reaching out for the assistance, because we're there.
So as we wrap up, are there any final comments that anyone would like to make or share on new projects that maybe the Historic Planning Office is working on, or other projects that Christine or Sian that you're currently involved with?
Well, I'm glad to share that from these ethnic cultural contexts and just the Survey LA Historic Context Statement in general, we are seeing an increased amount of nominations in the Office of Historic Resources associated with underrepresented communities, as well as resources not otherwise known to be significant. We are seeing more nominations of that sort in our office, and we consider that a victory. And we hope to continue to see more.
That's fantastic.
I would really like to give a shout out to Sara personally, because I haven't been able to do this in a public forum because there's no public forum anymore. But Sara very graciously suggested to me that I continue some work that I had done on the Japanese American context, and I applied for a fellowship through Friends of Residential Treasures Los Angeles, and I just recently completed what they call a trail map, but it's really kind of an interactive guidebook that takes people on a trip all around the city of Los Angeles and shares with them the work of post-war Japanese American architects in Los Angeles, this whole Nisei generation that was incarcerated, the trauma that they experienced, how that ended up changing and creating a legacy of work. And it's a legacy that we all can benefit through in the city. And without Sara telling me to do that, it never would have happened. So she's paying it forward, and I thank her very much for that.
And I would just say that as a result of all this work that the city of Los Angeles has been doing, a lot of other cities have been paying attention as well. And so there are a lot of interesting things going on throughout Southern California. I think based in part on the model provided by Survey LA, that, you know, we can't just look at architecture. We can't just consider one part of history when we're talking about, you know, especially planning departments, when we're trying to figure out what's historic about a city. So there's, like I said, there's been a lot of interesting things happening in the last couple of years, and Sian and I are actually working together on a new project for the city of Long Beach that deals with redlining and other discriminatory practices in housing in the post-war period. So what was happening after World War II, when large swaths of land were being subdivided, and that coincided with a lot of discriminatory efforts against African-American families for moving into certain neighborhoods. So that's been a really interesting and exciting project for us to work on as well. I mean, I say exciting, it's obviously a terrible part of our history, but it's great, and I commend the city of Long Beach for, you know, looking into this really difficult history. And so, like I said, I think there's a lot of cities that are starting to rethink the way they think about their own history, which is great.
That's fantastic. I'm going to just check and see if there are any other comments or questions. I think we're okay. So I want to say thank you very much to Sara, Christine, and Sian for participating in our talk today and for really bringing to light this very valuable resource in regards to the history that surrounds us. Not only in women's history, there are several other surveys that are available through the Department of Historic Preservation that you can check out. We have provided you a link to the survey on women's rights in Los Angeles, but please, if I will also add in the evaluation that will be sent out to all of those viewing, we'll also add a link to the site for the LA offices if you want to check out any other surveys and things like that. So before we leave you all today, I just want to share one last thing about our upcoming programs. So we have several more programs coming up for the Homestead Museum talks. Make sure that you check us out on the homesteadmuseum.org for any further updates, to also sign up for any of the upcoming programs. We're also on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, as well as a museum blog. The events that are coming up in just a couple of weeks: on Sunday, September 13th from 2 to 3:30, we have an early history of California winemaking that will be given by our facilities coordinator, and his name is Robert Barron. He's also a sommelier, so he'll be talking a lot about that early period of California winemaking in Southern California. On Friday, September 25th, from 10 to noon, will be the meeting of our nonfiction book club. And the topic, which seems very appropriate for our talk today, will be suffrage and women's rights. And on Sunday, September 27th, Paul Spitzeri, who is the museum's director, will be joining all Zoom participants to talk a little bit about life during wartime, the workmen and temple families in 1840s Los Angeles. Again, we'll be sending out an evaluation. Please fill that out. It is very important to communicate with us how you feel about the programs that we're offering, suggestions that you might have for us to improve. Alex will be dropping that on a link to that on Facebook now, and then everyone who is watching on Zoom can expect to find that in their email boxes tomorrow, usually by the afternoon. Thanks again to Christine, to Sarah, to Sian for joining us today, and I hope you all have a very good afternoon. Thanks so much.
Everyone.